Good morning. A warm welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley Sunday Forum, to those joining us on Zoom and to those joining us on Facebook. My name is Alex Havasi. I'm Vice President of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a secular, reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community, if you've not done so already. Membership forms are available on our website at humanist.org. That's humanist plural. A special welcome to those who are with us for the first time. We invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all our events listed on the website, humanist.org. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist community. You can find out how to donate again on our website at www.humanist.org.
Our speaker today will be Michael Eisenscher. Michael Eisenscher is now in his sixth decade of activism in the labor and progressive movements, in struggles for peace, civil rights, civil liberties, women's rights, immigrant rights, and environmental justice. From 1972 until 2003, he worked for unions as an organizer and negotiator. In 2003, he joined with other labor activists to found U.S. Labor Against the War, and served as its national coordinator for the next dozen years. Since retiring in 2015, he has continued his labor activity as a delegate to the Alameda Labor Council, helping to found its Climate and Environmental Justice Caucus. He also joined other Bay Area trade unionists to found Labor Rise for Climate, Jobs, Justice, and Peace, and is a member of the National Labor Network for Sustainability. Today, Michael will talk to us about the intersection of labor, environment, foreign policy, and 21st century capitalism. Please give Michael a warm humanist welcome.
I want to thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you this morning. Because people learn in different ways, I've created a slideshow that will overlap much of my narrative, but also provide some visuals that I would have to describe otherwise. So I'm going to move right now to the slideshow and do a screen share. You should be seeing my screen at this point. Good. Okay, this is about intersectionality. And what do I mean by that? I mean that all of the different struggles that go on don't go on in isolation. They're part of a fabric of social justice. And in fact, you can't successfully struggle for peace, for example, if you don't also deal with justice. You can't struggle for the environment if you don't also deal with militarism. And so what I've created here is what people may recognize as a Venn diagram that shows the overlapping intersections of these various struggles. You could recall that Vice President Al Gore, at one point after he left office, produced a video which was one of the first major contributions to making the question of climate change and global warming a national topic of conversation. But if you listen or watch that video, you will discover that it's titled Inconvenient Truth, his inconvenient truth did not mention militarism. Well, there are other inconvenient truths. And to prevent climate change from inflicting cataclysmic damage, threatening much of life on Earth and civilization as we know it, we have to demilitarize our foreign policy, end interventionist wars, break the grip that big carbon, or some people say big oil, and the military industrial complex have on our federal budget, our foreign policy, economy, and government. Peace is a climate goal because it is a climate necessity. War is an environmental nightmare. It pollutes and contaminates every place it is fought, contributing substantially to the carbon load of the planet. The military is the single largest consumer of fossil fuels on the planet. It's the single largest greenhouse gas polluter or emitter in the world. Throughout the U.S. Global War on Terror, the U.S. military emitted the equivalent of more than 257 million passenger cars, more than double the number of cars on the road today. War and climate change caused disasters are the principal drivers of global migration, the refugee crisis. War leaves us a deadly legacy. The physical, social, and financial impacts of war are felt for generations, and not just by the people in the countries where they are fought, but by us here at home. War, preparation for war and its aftermath, drain resources from the investment in renewable energy and energy infrastructure. It limits our ability to protect our most vulnerable frontline communities, deprives us of funds to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, and consumes resources needed to meet other critical human and social needs. The costs of war continue long after the fighting ends, in the form of ongoing care for our veterans, the social costs of addiction, depression, and other manifestations of PTSD, interest paid to service the war debt, which is part of our national deficit. National security and vital interests are euphemisms. They're used to justify wars, to protect corporate profits, defend investor interests, and maintain U.S. global dominance. The U.S. offers its allies a nuclear umbrella. It offers the protection of its nuclear arsenal. What the world needs is an effective binding global nuclear disarmament treaty. The biggest beneficiaries of war and militarism are big oil, the military-industrial complex, and Wall Street and the 1% wealthiest elite. The US military serves as global enforcer for the fossil fuel interests. Some of you may be familiar with General Smedley Butler, who was head of the Marine Corps and one of the most decorated soldiers in the Army at the time of the Second World War. And he said, war is a racket, and it's a racket fought in defense of the wealthy. The US military has been continuously at war for more than 20 years at a cost of more than $6 trillion. It's engaged in some form of armed conflict or military intervention on average every 6 months since World War II. Somebody, in fact, looked at the historical record and found that the US has been at peace, that is to say, its military not involved in any conflicts for fewer than 25 years of its total existence. The US has deployed special forces to 150 countries, more than 3/4 of all the nations on Earth. The military and military contractors consume $125 trillion per year. And the image you're seeing there is the division of our federal spending by category. And when we think about military spending, we have to also call into effect the cost of the past wars we've fought, which I mentioned earlier, the social cost and the financial cost. When we think about military spending, we also have to talk about more than the Pentagon budget. It's more than the cost of wars. It includes nuclear arms, and the arms budget is not in the Pentagon budget. Veterans benefits, which are covered by the VA, not the Pentagon, and the veterans' future care. We also have the debt and interest on the national debt and other security-related government costs that are found in other departments like the State Department. U.S. global reach is provided by more than 1.3 million men and women under arms, stationed in 800 foreign bases in 80 countries. We're the only country in the world that has that kind of global reach. If you took foreign bases of all the other countries in the world, there are a total of 70, compared to our one country having 800. This is reinforced by an arsenal of weapons and instruments of war. I list them there. US military might is unmatched by any other country in the world. In fact, we brag about it. The AFL-CIO Executive Council in 2001 described the US as having a militarized foreign policy. By the way, it's the only time the AFL-CIO has made that statement. It hasn't said it again since. The US military budget is greater than the next 9 nations by spending combined, roughly double what China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea spend all together. It's far more than is required to defend our country's borders and its people. In order to have a just transition to a sustainable energy society, we have to defend immigrant families, protect and meet the needs of frontline communities, assure the welfare of impacted workers in both fossil fuel and the military-industrial complex jobs, and support military personnel affected by our ending an aggressive foreign policy, which means we require fewer of them. The military is often described as the jobs program for the poor. So here we have our intersectionality symbol again. And we have to really see a common single struggle that has many facets. It's going to require unity if these movements are to achieve their own objectives without the support of others. It's impossible, for example, the civil rights movement, to make major headways without dealing with economic injustice. It's impossible to struggle for peace without considering the environmental impacts of war and militarism, or to struggle for the environment without considering the impact of militarism. So what's wrong with this picture? We're at the end of the Afghan war, and in the past, ends of wars used to be thought of as opportunities for a peace dividend, the opportunity to move resources that were spent on the military to meet other social needs. Well, the US Senate has just proposed to give the military $858 billion next year, 6% more than it gets this year. It's more money than the president requested. Democrats in the Senate are debating today the Inflation Adjustment Act, a strange euphemism, but one that plays to popular concerns. It would spend on average just $37 billion per year over 10 years, or a total of $370 billion on climate and environmental measures. So if you take the military budget and the amount being proposed to spend on the environment and fighting climate change gets 4.3% of what the military gets in the coming year. Of the top 20 military spenders, the US and NATO and their allies together spend more than double what Russia, China, and Iran spend. We need a new definition of national security. Real national security exists when people have fully covered health care, affordable education, efficient, affordable mass transit, modern, safe public infrastructure, a proper social safety net, sustainable carbon-free energy, protection of our environment, access to affordable food, and we were talking beforehand, access to housing. Real national security also requires that we respect international law, human rights, the rights of refugees, and our own Bill of Rights in the Constitution. We also have to aggressively act to defeat xenophobia, nativism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, and all the other fear-provoking isms that divide us. Real national security can only be achieved when all countries in the world dramatically reduce their consumption of fossil fuels, lower the threat posed by runaway global warming, and eliminate all nuclear weapons. Real national security also requires our country operates as a member of a global community of nations rather than using the instruments of fear in order to achieve global hegemony. Real national security can only exist when we tackle poverty, unemployment, alienation, and despair. These are the fertile fields on which terrorism grows, and we have to alleviate them globally, not just nationally. The fate of the least of us is tied to the fate of the rest of us as members of a single global human community. In order to prevent climate change from inflicting cataclysmic damage, threatening much of life on Earth and civilization as we know it, we're going to have to demilitarize our foreign policy, end interventionist wars, and break the grip that big carbon has, as well as the military industrial complex has on our federal budget, our foreign policy, economy, and government. We've got to decarbonize and demilitarize. There can be no peace without solidarity and justice, because peace is not about more than just us, or peace is about more than just us. We've got to rise together for climate, jobs, justice, and peace. That concludes the formal presentation. I want to let you know a little bit about what I'm doing. It relates to some of the links you see here. During the Teamsters UPS part-timers strike in 1997, I started sending our friends of mine in the labor movement articles about the strike. And then people asked me to continue doing that after the strike ended. And then I began sending articles about wars that were breaking out and other issues, the environment, climate. And so I formed what was called Solidarity Info Service and created a number of news lists. And those news lists continued throughout the years. I didn't give it a lot of time, but a few hours every week. When I retired in 2015, I got much more involved in developing Solidarity Info Service as a major project. I created a website and I began creating memes. Actually, it's my form of psychological therapy. When I get pissed off about something, I can create a meme in order to make a comment about it and post it to Facebook or other social media. And I put it up on these websites, on the website, solidarityinfoservice.org. I also created a formal twice weekly news service, and I send out links to articles, essays, commentary, videos, slideshows like this one, and other resources that people can use on a variety of issues: foreign policy, militarism, climate, racial and social economic justice, about our own movement and the struggles we organize. So I'm going to put some of these links in the chat when I finish, so you won't have to write them down. You can just copy and paste. This slideshow is also available, and the URL is at the bottom. Another inconvenient truth dash slides. And notice the capitalization of each word. That's required. So you have to follow the capitalization. Another inconvenient truth dash slides. So this is going to conclude my presentation. And let's see if we can stop sharing. There are the Solidarity Info Service links, and I'll put some others in the chat as we go along. So now I really want to have a conversation. I want to hear what you have to say and what you think about what you heard and your own observations about where we're at and where we need to go. So I'm happy to entertain your questions or comments. I assume one of you will moderate.
Yeah, I thought it was, I'm not sure what you mean by creating memes.
Oh, all right.
Example.
Let me bring up a page. I'm going to go back. Get back here. Hang on a second. Go back to screen share. And this is what I mean by memes. Posters, political messages. And they're on a variety of topics, as you can see.
Okay.
So when I get pissed off, that's my therapy.
Okay, and when you talked about demilitarizing our foreign policy, I'm not sure what steps that would involve. It seems to me, we also want to promote democracy and humanistic values around the world. And when we have a situation where, the Turks would like to suppress the Kurds, and there's a lot of that going on all over the world,
Right. Right.
I'm not sure what we've done for it, but can we just walk away from all that? And
demilitarizing foreign policy is not a single act.
No.
Process. It's a struggle that we're going to have to engage in. Let's take the war in Ukraine, for example. The first instinct of the US government and the Congress was to send more arms and to invest more in the military in Ukraine, basically being prepared to fight down to the last Ukrainian. Why didn't we send more diplomats? Why didn't we create a peacekeeping force at the United Nations in order to prevent the war? Why did we continue to move NATO into encircling Russia and creating the kind of paranoia that they have about being under military assault or threat? I mean, these are all things that are part of our foreign policy that we have our ability to change, and we're going to have to change our government, which means elect new leaders in order to make that happen. And that's part of this struggle. But it can't be just that piece of it. It's got to be a struggle around nuclear weapons and getting back to the denuclearization treaties, the peace treaties that the Trump administration walked away from. Getting the agreement back instated with Iran, which we ended. We canceled that agreement and walked away from it. And now we're saying it's up to Iran to reinstate it. These are all foreign policy decisions. It has to do with what we spend our money on. Should we be investing the kind of money we're spending now, $858 billion on a war machine, when we have people living in boxes and tents on under our freeways? When we have a pandemic for which we did not have sufficient resources? We have a social safety net that lets all kinds of people fall through it. We need to take some of those resources and create programs that allow people whose jobs today depend on militarism or fossil fuels to move to other kinds of work. For example, let's take the refineries up in Richmond. We can have a fund that says to the workers in that refinery, anybody who is within 5 or 10 years of retirement can go out with full pay until they reach normal retirement age and then go on to their pensions. And we'll pay the difference between anything you earn now at a lower paid job and normal retirement. We could pay to retrain and re-educate that workforce. The younger people can find other kinds of jobs, but they're going to need to be prepared to do it. We could pay to relocate people to where jobs can be found. Companies all the time pay to relocate their managers. They spend millions of dollars to move people across the country. They even buy them homes or buy out their old homes. We could do that to enable workers to continue. In other words, we can guarantee that the people whose jobs today depend upon exploiting the planet and ruining the planet to have economic security.
There's some other hands up. So Matt.
I'm going to be a little nitpicky here because nobody else had their hands up at the moment, but now people do. But in an early slide, you said something like the military emits the equivalent of 240 something million cars. I don't remember what it was.
257.
Was it 57? 257?
Yeah, the amount of emissions by the military during the war, during the war on terror, was the equivalent of putting 257 million cars on the road, more cars on the road.
Okay. Well, what was unclear is that there was not over a length of time. Was that the equivalent of 257 per year, or
No.
and
if you take all the accumulated emissions over the course of the war on terror,
Okay.
It would be as if we put 257 million cars on the road. They would emit that amount of additional pollution.
Right.
greenhouse
Over what period of time? Because a car.
Instantly.
Okay.
Instantly. That, in other words, if you take them and let them operate on the road for a year,
Okay.
that
Over a year.
year's worth would be equivalent to 20 years of emissions on the war on terror.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
That was it. I was just saying it was a nitpicky kind of thing.
that's fine. I want to be
Period of
clear.
time.
I want to be clear.
That's it. Thanks.
Hey, Jerry or Dana?
Yeah, one of the things that it's an indication of U.S. priority is that when Dennis Kucinich was in Congress, he proposed the Department of Peace, and he wanted to fund it with 1% of the cost of the military,
Right,
and that idea went nowhere.
right. That's right.
Okay.
It seems to me
Dan.
as though spending that money on the Department of Peace would have been much more effective.
That's true.
I'd like to say something too, which is I belong to a peace organization, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and I used to demonstrate regularly at Lockheed, and actually even when my ex-husband was working there. And I just like to point out that my husband was a physicist in high energy physics, and when he came to look for a job in California, really the only jobs around here that were available were either in Lockheed Aerospace or at certain companies which provided support to the military in forms of technological development, like radar and other things.
Right.
And so that's the kind of job he ended up taking, and then subsequently ended up, even though he didn't want to work in the military industry, at Lockheed for a few years. And what I discovered when I was in this peace organization, that many of the women that were active in it had husbands who worked at Lockheed their whole lives, made tons of money, and retired with a good pension. And these wives were, liberated from having to work by this, and they were able to participate in the peace organization. Wow. Somehow this seems like a colossal waste of energy.
Well,
And-
think of this another way. We talked about the emissions from cars compared to the wars. What about the brain power that is now invested in figuring out how to kill and control people? If that same amount of brain power were invested in solving our social problems, in how to improve life for people here and around the world. All that wasted brain power, not just resources, it's the foregone opportunity cost of militarism and imperialism.
Well, there is an argument contrary to that, which I've heard many times from other physicists and so on, which is that over a very long period of history, many of the most important technological advances were made by the military or for military purposes, because
Right.
the anxiety created by the danger was so great that they really put a lot of energy into coming up with these technical improvements, and have contributed greatly to the development of modern society.
Well, let's take, a famous inventor,
Like Leonardo da Vinci.
Benjamin Franklin. Okay.
Okay.
He was forever inventing things, many of which didn't work, but many of those things today we use all the time, or their successors. What if we had 100,000 Benjamin Franklins putting their creative energy to use to solve our problems? It might not develop the same products that we have today, but it would develop other products that improve our lives, and maybe some of the same ones, because some of the problems we are trying to tackle using military technology are problems we would have tackled anyway. Right? So I don't buy the argument that we have to have wars and military in order to be creative and to solve our problems or to invent things. We could put people in space without fighting any wars.
And you know what? I think most women anyway would agree with you.
That's right. And by the way, I want to say WILPF is one of the oldest peace organizations in the country. It has generations of experience in standing up for peace and against militarism. And I've worked, when I was working for US Labor Against the War, I worked extensively with WILP members. Thank you for your service.
I just wanted to mention, I graduated from college in 1969. And at that time, you could only get occupational deferments in the military. So I went and worked on for a defense contractor that was doing a project for the Navy about rescue submarines. And the purpose was to rescue people from submarines that sank and didn't come up. And so you look at it and it's benign, but I'm looking at it as whatever technology we develop, they can use for anything else they want. I quit that job after 2 years because I couldn't stand working for the military.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things that's obvious about war, which is often neglected, is it is so wasteful of resources. I mean, it goes nowhere. It does a lot of damage, and it costs a lot of money to repair the damage that it's created. It may be good for the GDP, but it's not good for anybody, including the United States.
We can walk away from the war in Afghanistan or in Iraq, but what we leave behind is an environmental nightmare. I mean, think of what we did to Vietnam.
Agent Orange.
Defoliation, yeah, Agent Orange. I mean, those were war crimes for which nobody has ever been prosecuted, not to mention go to jail.
And a lot of American servicemen suffered as a result of Agent Orange.
Absolutely. They brought it home. They brought the war home, and they had to live with it every day of their lives, and their families have to live with it. And those are our peers, right? We're of that age group.
Yeah.
I was a student in University of Wisconsin-Madison in the early 60s, and I dropped out of college. I was just not, it wasn't for me. I got called up for induction in 1964. Well, by then I was already involved in the early anti-war movement. And so I brought a bunch of my friends with me. And when I went inside, they stood outside and picketed. And when I sat down in this room with this group of kids, you know, my age then, late teens, early 20s, all guys, there may be 30 people in the room. And there was some recruiting officer up at the front, you know, doing the selling job. And so I would periodically just raise my hand and ask them questions, just ask questions. Well, that lasted about 10 minutes. And they asked me to get up, and they put me in a room by myself so that they could go on selling their propaganda for the war. A few months later, I got a 4F. You might remember 4F was disqualified. Usually it was for, you know, medical reasons. Well, mine was a security 4F. Later on in the war, they actually prosecuted people who did what I did. But in that early piece of the war, they were just dismissing them from military service.
Yeah.
Zem's had his hand up for a while. Call on him. Zem, Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear
Okay.
you. Michael, since you have extensive experience and history with the labor movement, I wanted to ask you about what you think about collective bargaining. I always found it a bit bizarre. For example, if you look at the attempts to, organize the workers at Amazon fulfillment centers, what Christian Smalls was doing. I think he did the one near JFK, right? Because there's also one in Staten Island. And what I also found bizarre is that we have the right to unionize, and yet our right to unionize is held hostage by the decision of other employees in the company. They will vote on whether you have the right to unionize. Do you think it would be a better system in which every employee could individually decide whether or not to join a union?
Well, actually, that is what happens. I was an organizer for most of my career. In order to have a union in a company under US law, federal law, I had to sign up a minimum of 30% of the employees in that workplace just to have an election to decide whether or not this would become a union workplace.
Yeah, but that's what I'm arguing against, right?
Yeah, but wait a minute. In Europe, in most other countries, you don't have to do that. You just set up a union. Whoever joins it, right?
Exactly, right.
And your ability to bargain is dependent on how many people join. Well, that actually is what exists right now in the right to work states. That's what right to work means. Right to work for less. Mostly Southern, but not exclusively. What that is, it's an amendment to the national labor law that says nobody can be forced to join a union.
Does it also eliminate the need for the vote?
You can have the vote, which would require let's say, I'll give you an example. A majority of the people in an Amazon warehouse vote to have a union. That requires, under law, requires Amazon to bargain in good faith. Doesn't require them to sign a contract. To bargain in good faith. Whether you can get a contract will depend on how many people join the union, how strong you are, right? The implicit threat of withholding your labor is what the employer faces in deciding how much to give their workers. So if everybody has a right not to join the union, it weakens the bargaining leverage of the rest of the workers. That is why, if you look at the right to work states, all of them have the lowest standards of living, the lowest minimum wage, the lowest and poorest social safety network, the lowest wage standards overall. The right to work is a right to work for less. The right not to join a union is a right to work for less. It's a libertarian fiction. You have a right not to join a union without a union. I mean, right now, Amazon workers, they have a right not to join a union. They're not required.
But they don't have the right to join a union unless other workers agree to it.
Unless,
and,
yes.
that's the part that I don't understand.
But that is the definition of a union. A union is a collective of workers coming together for
Right.
to defend their mutual interests.
Right.
It's an act of solidarity.
I don't know if you understood my question. Is that individuals should be able to join the union without having.
I hear you. And I'm saying that principle leads to a worse outcome for all workers, for all of them. Let's suppose I'm one of those workers who doesn't want a union. Why don't I want a union? Well, maybe the boss said, if you don't join the union, you can have a promotion. So I get promoted, right? I get promoted. That's one person, 100 wages as a result. We want to live in? Dog eat dog? Make a deal for yourself and screw everybody else? Is that humanism? I don't think so. To me, humanism is about social solidarity. It's about people loving one another and sticking up and being in community with one another. Well, that's what a union is in a workplace. It's an expression of human values.
But I'm sort of agreeing with you, not disagreeing. I'm saying that it should be easier to join a union and not have it held hostage by a vote by the majority of employees in a given place. I should be able to join the union on my own.
You can. I can join a union right now. I'm not even employed. I can join a union, pay dues, right? If I were a non-union worker in a non-union warehouse, Amazon,
Right.
I could join the union and pay dues. But
I know that. Okay.
But I'm not benefiting from a contract unless I get other workers with me to sit down with the boss and bargain. So I can join a union and pay dues, but that comes off the top of my already low wages.
Right.
The right to work for less.
Alex, you're
Anyone
muted.
else?
Great. Carl, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I've got two comments. One is that, as far as I know, the right to work says what union members want is the ability to force other people who don't want to join the union to join the union. Is that correct?
No,
That's what it means. It means
no,
force.
It doesn't mean force, because under the law right now,
Yes.
liberal law, you don't have to join a union.
Oh,
Nobody-
you do. You do
nobody-
if
wait a minute.
if it's a union shop.
No.
If it's a union shop,
union-
everybody has
The
to
union
join.
shop, excuse me, the union shop is no longer legal in the United States.
So
So
what's your
even-
argument? What's your argument? People in the South could join a union and that would be it. It's just that if not enough people join, then they won't have much power. So anyway,
Let me use an example, a different kind of example. We live in a so-called democracy, right?
right.
That means we elect people who make the laws. And even though I didn't vote for them, I'm subject to those laws, right? The law is our social contract. I'm subject to the laws, even though I don't like the people who made the laws. And I think the laws are terrible.
Yes. But that's a democracy. And then we're talking about government. This we're talking about here is labor unions. And anyway, I just happen to belong to my background. I had a lot of people in my background who belonged to unions, but they all had union shops. And if you wanted to belong or not, you had to. And if I've never heard the fact that you cannot have a union shop. I believe that's part of the contract.
That may be a reflection of your age, because the people you're talking to about that
Yes.
are no longer in those workplaces, and the law has changed.
So what's the deal now? What's the deal now?
The
If
deal
you don't want
now,
to join a union, what happens to you?
the
Now,
deal
I'm in the
now-
South and I don't want to join a union.
Yeah.
I'm
Excuse
a
me.
right to work state. Now what?
Let me answer your question. Let's
Okay.
say two examples. I'm in a southern state. I'm in Alabama. My workplace is non-union. I have a right not to join a union, right? I don't join. I want a union. I sign up for the union. But the majority of the people in the workplace don't want a union. I get no union. Now, a majority of the people in the workplace decide they want a union. And the boss sits down to bargain, and they end up with a contract that everybody under law is subject to, like the laws. In other words, the fact that I didn't join the union doesn't mean I'm exempt from getting the benefits. I get the benefits. I become a freeloader. I'm not paying dues. I'm under the union contract. I get whatever everybody else is getting. I no longer have a legal right to make a side deal with the boss. Okay. Now, let's take a different example. I'm in the North. I'm in California. There's no right to work. I'm required not to join the union, but I'm required to pay a service fee to the union for the collective bargaining services from which I benefit, even though I'm not in the union. All right. And the service fee is lower than the dues because it doesn't include any of the money that goes to other things that unions do, like politics, for example. All I'm paying for is the negotiation of the contract and its administration. So I'm not a member of the union, right? But I have a grievance. The boss did something to me. I have a right under that contract to file the grievance, and the union has a legal obligation to represent me, even though I'm not paying any dues.
That's bizarre.
That's the law.
Well, it makes sense to me, but anyway, that's beside the point. So I was going to go switch the subject now to war and some of your ideas about war. You know, it turns out that what happens if the other guy on the other side of the table doesn't give a crap about what you think? What are you going to do? It's the same thing. It has to do with force. So the question is, are you going to force them? So what do you think you could ever do to get the Russians to agree, or let's say the Chinese right now, to agree to what you want, your goal? And of course, part of the goal of having a military is to keep them from coming in, right, to everybody. So anyway, it sounds interesting, but on the other hand, I don't see the practicality of it. It's an interesting goal. I'm sure that goal has been around, as far as I know, since I was a little child.
Yes, Jesus.
It hasn't happened.
Let me respond to that. Foreign policy, I said, is a process, not an act. It's a process that involves negotiation, diplomacy. You can make choices about where you put your emphasis. When the Soviet Union split up, right? And all of those countries became independent. A number of them joined NATO. Why? NATO said, we're going to give you a protection, an umbrella of security against the Russians, should they ever decide to want to come back and get you. Okay? But that wasn't enough. We began building military bases all over Europe. We began putting our missile systems in Europe aimed at Russia. Now, we know what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis when Russia tried to put a missile in Cuba, right? We damn near came to nuclear war.
So your thought, okay. You've had a long talk now, so I'd like to make some comments too about what you're saying.
I want to answer the question. And if you want a one-word answer, I have no one-word answer for you. We're talking about complex subjects. Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated an end to that crisis. There is not a single war in the world that doesn't end by a negotiation, which means there's not a single war in the world that couldn't be prevented by negotiation. Unless you're dealing with a raving maniac who is incapable of making rational decisions. Countries make decisions as states, not individuals. Putin doesn't decide. There are interest groups in Russia, just like the United States. There's a military industrial complex in Russia, just like the United States. There's a ruling class of rich people in Russia, just like the United States. He answers to them. Kennedy had to answer to the ruling class in our society, as Biden does today. If you start with a militaristic attitude, you end up with military confrontation, because it's, remember the slide, the hammer? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. What if we dismantle those 800 bases around the world? No other country needs 800 bases. Why do we? Why do we? Because our ruling class wants to be the dominant power in the world. Hegemony. We're not content to be a competitor. We want to be in control. Why? Because our rich people, the people who benefit from this stuff, stand to benefit more if they control more of the world's resources. So when I'm going off in the military to fight, I'm fighting to defend their profits. That's what Smedley Butler was saying. I was a gangster for capitalism. That's what he said. The military today is the gangster group that enforces the control of the fossil fuel industry around the world. We don't send our military to places where we don't want things. Name one country where we sent military that we don't have some stake as a state interest.
So your argument is somehow or another, all these people someday are going to get together and make an agreement that meets your goals, the goals that you have. Is that correct?
Not some way or another. Not some way, but by a conscious effort, organized internationally.
Well, we have that now with the United Nations, and it ain't working.
The United Nations is a captive of the 5 nuclear powers that run the Security Council.
Yeah, and it ain't going to be any different until those people agree with what you're saying, correct?
Until the people of the United States decide they want a different kind of foreign policy. Until we decide we want to spend our resources building houses, not bombs. Until we decide that we don't need 800 bases. They're not going to close overnight, but we start a process of de-escalating.
So in your mind's eye, is this process going to take 100 years?
It'll take whatever it takes, but it is less risky than the process we're in right now, which is escalation.
I don't know about that. I don't see the world the way you do, but I can understand that you could believe that.
Let me put it to you this way. If the military is the single greatest polluter in the world, and we, if you believe in science, understand we have only a few decades to go before our planet becomes mostly uninhabitable. And if the military continues to put out emissions the way it does, then we don't have to worry about what's going to happen in a century. We won't be here.
Well, anyway, I feel like I'm taking up too much time now, but you know, you'd have a hell of a time convincing me that there's anything in the near future, even a reasonably near future, to reach the goals you want. Not that I disagree with them.
The near future is tomorrow. The near future is, what do you do as a citizen of this country to hold your government accountable tomorrow? Then you understand, well, doing it one by one is not going to work. We need to be organized. That's why we build that's why WILPF functions as it does. That's why we have unions in US Labor Against the War, to become an organized influence over how our country makes decisions, to affect who gets elected.
How's that working?
It's a damn hard struggle.
Yeah.
But it beats the alternative, which is capitulation.
Okay. Hey, Alex, I think you should take some time in there now.
Okay. No, I just want to discuss, or turn to the topic, I guess. You mentioned kind of in passing that we had, a nuclear arms treaty and we walked away from it. And I think that's kind of a problem with our government, in that foreign policy can change every 4 years on a dime. And I think that's an advantage that Xi has in China, and possibly Putin, although he's doesn't strike me as being as smart, but I'm not in a position to judge that. Is there, at the present time, is there a real advantage to dictatorship if we're fighting, if we recognize the goals? I mean, and the problem is that
Can you name in
if
history?
if you have a capable dictator, there's no guarantee that he won't remain capable throughout his term.
Can you name a single dictator in history who was a benevolent dictator?
But it depends
Name
on what
one.
you mean by benevolent.
Well, who's totally devoted to the interests of his country, not his own interests.
Well, Napoleon did a lot of good.
Yeah,
Right?
he had a lot of
He
wars.
created the French legal system.
He created a lot of wars, and a lot of people died. So
That's true.
Napoleon could be a general, right? So that was not benevolent. That was by virtue of muscle, of arms. Name one who is a benevolent dictator. You can't. There's no such thing.
Michael,
So
if
if
there's
there
no
are-
such thing as a benevolent dictator, don't you need a military to deter those evil dictators?
Well, more often than not, the military becomes the instrument of the dictator, because militaries answer to the state. So whoever controls the state directs the military. And if you have a dictatorship, it means one or small group of people make the decisions for everybody. Democracy is a terrible thing, but it beats everything else. It's not perfect. It's an imperfect way of governing, but it beats dictatorship, authoritarianism, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Jerry or Dana.
Yeah, so I just learned a few weeks ago that the UN has a treaty that says that all nuclear weapons are illegal, and it was ratified about in January of 2021, and I never heard about it until recently.
Because our country never ratified it.
Yeah, which is not at all surprising, but it's not just that we didn't ratify it, it's also the media isn't saying anything about it.
Well, exactly. But who do the media work for?
Oh, I know the answer to that. I'll let you
Okay.
answer that.
Okay, I don't have to answer it. You can answer it yourself.
Yeah, well, it's basically most of the medias are the media is supposed to be run by about 5 or 6 large companies in the United States, the U.S. media. Which reminds me, I had somebody tell me recently that, and I've heard this said by others as well, that basically there are a lot of things that Americans don't know that people all around the world do know, because the media is different in the rest of the world.
Yeah,
in fact,
and I'm sure that's equally true in Russia, where the media is even more controlled. Right.
In fact, I one time was in a room with about 15 people. It was about and 3 of them were foreigners, and my opinion was that the foreigners were much more politically savvy than Americans.
Well, number one, their education systems probably are better at teaching students to think critically and to know things about the rest of the world. And number two, they probably come from a country which is weaker than the United States and can't make assumptions about things, and therefore has to actually know something about the world they're living in.
Yeah, I spent a year in Germany, which included watching some news, and it was interesting to see how much the news was talking about other countries. In fact,
Yeah.
I often saw interviews happening in front of the White House or in front of Congress on
Yeah.
German television. And I also saw them reporting on Erich Honecker, who was the head of the East Germany at the time.
Right.
So
It's true. It's true.
Oh,
And
yeah,
one of the benefits of
Okay.
technology, by the way, is that because we now have streaming TV capabilities, I can actually watch the foreign news services on my television. If I pay for it, I sign up for it. So I can look at Russian, French, German, in English. They have services in English, like Radio Liberty or Victory, whatever. So you can say, well, that's their propaganda. Well, yeah, but it gives me a different way of looking at the world that I can then use my critical faculties to decide what I want to believe about my own government. I don't have to accept what they're saying, but I also don't have to accept what my government tells me. I can make an independent decision.
Say something more about the 50 countries. I'd like to say something about the fact that 50 countries signed this treaty or agreement about ending nuclear war. And your remarks that this is a process, not an event or act. So maybe that is a hopeful sign. And it's true that none of these 50 countries have nuclear weapons. And it's true that none of the nuclear weapon countries signed it. But possibly, it is the beginning of a process. And if more countries, let's say around 200 countries, sign up against nuclear war, maybe that'll put some pressure on the nuclear countries.
Here's the problem with that. I agree with you, but here's the problem. If I set off in my car to drive to Chicago, I'm not going to get there if I try to do it on one tank of gas or one charge of my EV. So I may run out before I reach my destination, unless I refuel. So we theoretically might wait long enough to get more of the countries of the world on board, but we might wait too long and we run out of steam before that can take place. And the out of steam is either a quick exit, humanity takes the fast train to annihilation and extinction with a nuclear war, or the slow road through climate change, which is not slow because it's going to happen in this century if we continue what we're doing right now. You know what? One thing I didn't say. All of the rules, international rules about reporting your emissions, the US demanded in those agreements that it wouldn't have to count emissions from the military. So we don't even keep track of it. Under international rules, we don't report what our military contributes to global warming.
Quick comment. You said that we have a few decades to deal with climate change. From everything I've heard, we don't have that time. Variations from 1,000 days to 10 years, what I hear.
Well, it depends on what you're expecting to happen. What the science tells us right now is that if we do nothing at all and continue at the same rate we are now, we will increase global warming by 4 to 5 degrees by 2050. If we institute measures to control what's happening now, we can slow that rate down, extend it, but it's still going to increase. We have to go beyond that to actually bring down the contributions to global warming in order to slow and then reverse that process. And that's going to be a long-term, hundreds of years process. But what's important is between now and 2050, we'll determine which direction, which road we're taking, okay? I have a metaphor I use when I'm talking to union people about this. Say, the train's leaving the station and we've got a choice. We can be in the locomotive, helping to decide what route to take. We can be in the caboose, being dragged along by other people who are making the decision. We can get left at the station if the train leaves without us, or we can end up as roadkill on the tracks. Those are the choices humanity faces right now. And the choice will depend on what we do to slow the rate of global warming, of contributing greenhouse gas to the problem.
I don't understand how those four options relate to climate change.
Well, for workers in fossil fuel industries, it's pretty clear. If society has to go to a sustainable energy future to survive, I want to be in the locomotive helping to decide how that happens so that I don't end up roadkill on the tracks, a victim of other people's decisions.
Well, that sounds like you think there's two options. You're either in the locomotive or you're in the roadkill camp.
No, I can get dragged along with the rest of society by other people. Or I can be left standing at the station with, with a thumb up my ass as everybody else goes forward, which in effect, you're right, ends up putting me on the tracks eventually. So what I say to the labor movement is you cannot put your head in the sand and pretend all of this is going to go away if you don't pay any attention to it. I say the same thing to everybody else I talk to.
I'm a climate activist, and I don't understand why there aren't more climate activists, because it seems to me as though it's pretty clear that it's a serious threat. And I, you say that what happens over the next 50 years, 100 years matters. Yeah, I agree with that. But if we go on the continued route, nothing changes for the next years, I think it really is too late. Things get totally out of control.
One of the memes that I made this weekend says something like, if you like the climate we have with a 1.2 degree increase in global warming since pre-industrial days, you're going to love 3 degrees or 4 degrees or 5 degrees. Look at what we're dealing with just 1.2 degrees. This is not a steady increase. It's a hyperbole, right? It goes up at an accelerating rate as we cross trigger points. For example, in Antarctica, we're about to cross a trigger point that one of the biggest glaciers in Antarctica, the ice shelf, is going to break loose. What's that going to do to global warming as sea levels rise? We have a debate right now in Oakland about where they're going to put the new A's stadium. And the A's want to put it at the port, which will be underwater in 50 years if we continue what we're doing, which means the public's going to foot the bill to build a stadium and give them all kinds of tax breaks. They get to take the money, and when the stadium is no longer usable, they run, and we're stuck with a stadium. We can turn it into a water park.
There was a,
You know, the other thing yesterday I went to a demonstration, okay? It was the 10th anniversary of the big Chevron fire in Richmond. So, you know, we went out there. Who was there? There were a lot of people with gray hair or no hair at all, but most of them were young people. You know, we have a saying, the future belongs to the young. It does. And they're going to decide for us. The only question is whether we help them. Whether we drag our feet and let them suffer. We're not going to pay, you know, you and I aren't going to be around. It doesn't matter to me. I'm not going to suffer the consequence. Sea level can go as high as it wants. I won't be here. But future generations are going to pay for my indifference. I have a social obligation. It's called intergenerational solidarity. Think back to when you were a teenager or young adult in the 60s. We used to say, you don't have to listen to old people. They, you know, what do they know? We know everything now. I used to say that. They screwed it up. We don't have to pay attention. Well, I began listening and I learned a few things that I made useful in my life later on. But it took me a while to figure that out. These young people are going to either do it with our help or without it. But they're going to have to do it because life is going to tell them they have no choice. How much pain and suffering do you want to put in our legacy as a generation to future generations? That's the question. That's it. Simple equation. How much pain and suffering do you want to inflict on future generations? We get to decide by what we do today. You can go bowling, play golf, or go to a picket line. Write a letter to Congress. Call a talk show. Talk to your neighbor. You don't have to be you don't have to be Martin Luther King, you know, the leader. Sign up to be a foot soldier in this war. It's a bad metaphor, but I'm going to use it anyway. Volunteer. Don't wait to be drafted. Do it for your kids and the grandkids.
there's a comment earlier about news in different parts of the world. And I'm not sure it's so much better than ours. It's just a different point of view, but you need more than one.
Yeah.
I heard someone, I don't remember who it was, a long time ago, talked about it. She was growing up and her parents had moved from country to country and she attended school there. She said she loved history because she got the same story, but it was entirely different in each country.
History is told by the winner.
Yeah.
In the United States, the winner, the rich people, write the history. Right? That's what African Americans are telling us now. We refuse to acknowledge the imprint that slavery had on our society today. The benefits that we enjoy today because of what slaves contributed in labor 100 years ago, 150 years.
And the thing about the media is they make their money by what they sell, which means they want to get listeners, they want to get people to view what they have, and it's like getting more flies with honey than
right.
They don't want to present bad news about what we're doing. We're always going to be the good guys.
Right. That's right. We have the white hats. They have the black hats. That's what Alex Jones is really, that's what he's all about. Sensationalizing anything, say anything, doesn't matter. Doesn't have to be true, as long as it brings advertisers and donors. Well, now he's going to find out it has a cost.
Yeah, and I think you're probably right. What we need is more activists. I don't know how effective pickets are because I don't know what attention they get. But yeah, call a talk show, letters to the editor.
Well, one demonstration never did anything.
Yeah, present your view.
For being persistent and convincing more people to join you, that's what does it. Building a union I have to get more people to join me if I want a strong union. Building a strong society, a democratic, peaceful, humane society requires I have to convince more people to come with me. If they don't want to come to my picket line, that's fine. But do other things that help.
Yeah, Jerry or Dana.
Yeah, demonstrations matter a lot, but I'd also like to point out that in the terms of the Vietnam War, I think an important point was when Eugene McCarthy decided to run for president on an anti-war platform, and the pundit said, "Oh, he hasn't got a chance." Then he got 10% in New Hampshire, and that turned everything upside down. Shortly after that, LBJ announced he was not running for re-election, and then Bobby Kennedy announced that he was running on an anti-war platform. I think that Eugene McCarthy made a big difference in tipping the country against the war.
And Bernie's making a big difference in what he does.
Yay,
I don't understand how he can, at his age, I can't keep up with him. I don't know where he must have a secret.
Maybe because he really believes what he's doing.
Well, I guess he's got good genes too. That helps.
Yes, so.
He has a strength of 10 because his heart is pure.
Right. Well, I think we probably exhausted my throat if we haven't exhausted the issues. I don't expect everybody here to swallow everything I had to say, but I gave you the link to the slideshow. Look at the slideshow. Think about those individual slides. Believe what you want to believe. And then,
you could
make your own decision.
put the link in the chat box.
Yeah.
Then we'll have a record of it. Thank you.
Could I ask it's a short question that probably would require a long answer. But the amount of public lying, the lying by public figures, Alex Jones may be the most dramatic one, but he wasn't the first, won't be the last. But do you have any practical suggestions? How do we counter that? He's getting his comeuppance some in the being sued by the parents of the children that were killed in New England. What are there other ways that have occurred to you where we could address it?
Well, let's speak more broadly. There's a fascist current in our society, which, if left to its own devices, is going to take us down the authoritarian road to ruin, the fascism. And I don't use that term freely. I use it very specifically. So I think about the consequences of that. It means we've got to build a movement that rejects it. We've got to do what the women and some of the men of Kansas did in rejecting the end of right to abortion, of women's autonomy. They express themselves, and we've got to express ourselves either directly by not using the advertisers that they use, that paid for his show, by confronting him physically and politically with an opposition, by creating our own voices, which are louder, which means donating to organizations that will use our megaphone to offer a different message, and by suing the crap out of him when he lies about things like what he did.
Show